presenters. In fact, we actually have a panel in the middle session, but we actually have 3 different presentations. And to kick off with the first presentation, we have 2 presenters who are going to talk to us about towards an invisible e-infrastructure for identifying data and authors. So we have Amir Irani and Adrian Burton. Amir Irani is rolling out the project for the Australian Research Data Common Party Infrastructure, and Adrian Burton is the Director of Services at the Australian National Data Service.
Thanks, Jennifer, for the introduction. Looking around the room, many of us are either working for the research infrastructure or either we are researchers. So I would assume that we are familiar with the problem of connecting the data and publications to the researcher and author of the work. Now, in this talk, which divided to 2 parts, first, I will talk about the concept of identity awareness. And in the second part, Adrian Burton, the director of ANDS, will talk about an international project between the ORCID and DataCite and how they address the identity awareness challenge in their environment. These days, based on what we have seen so far in this conference, researchers produce data more than ever. DNA sequencing machine produce 26 billion characters per day. That would add up to 9 trillion units of data per year. The Square Array radio telescope in 2020 is going to produce 1 petabyte of data per 20 seconds. We had a discussion in this conference. Virtual labs are already real. We can see that researchers from different backgrounds, from human to social science, physics and biology, they work on research data sets that are curated and stored in other institutions, in other countries, and sometimes in other continents. In October 2010, the high-level expert group on scientific data presented a report to the European Commission responsible for digital agenda. The report called Riding the Wave, and it has a strong emphasis on the role of the scientific data in the new paradigm of scientific discovery. It described a set of challenges for the governments and research institutions in this new paradigm, but also it talks about opportunity here. This is a quote from Nelly Kroes, the Vice President of European Commission. Her vision is a scientific community that does not waste resources on reproducing data that's been already created. In particular, if the public money has helped to collect those data in the first place. If today's researchers spend 80% of their time for collecting data and 20% on doing the actual research, this would be the opportunity to change the pattern. Also, this is an opportunity for new frontiers in research when we can actually work on research questions that are beyond the resources of individual institutions. In Australia, in the last few years, we had a unique opportunity to basically establish a number of data infrastructures across the country. As a result, many of research groups that previously had their data sets sitting on their notebook or on a server behind a firewall, now they have their data published in the public repositories like Research Data Australia. And the number of these published data collections are growing very rapidly. But what is interesting is not the growth of the data, but the coverage of this data across Australia. As a nation and as a scientist, it is a very interesting opportunity when you can discover information almost about every part of this continent. Now, as a researcher, to me, there is no point to have so much data when I cannot find what I'm looking for. If I pick up the journal paper which relates to my research, I want to be able to access that data. The concept of identity awareness is about what we need to do to make the data accessible, to make the data discoverable, to make the data reusable by the researcher. And at the end of the day, we give us the ability to measure the impact of the research. Now, for a data infrastructure to be able to say, okay, well, we have the infrastructure that provides this identity awareness, you need to be able to answer 4 different questions. Can you identify the researcher who created the data set? Can you find all the publications that are using this data set? Can you identify the project or the research grant that funded the collecting the data? At this kind of stage, it is close to impossible for funding bodies like ARC or NHMRC to reliably measure the research impact, and that has a significant impact in the strategic planning for the research funding. Last but not the least, can we identify the license and the access right for the data set? We need to guarantee that the reuse of data comply with the legal, ethical, and the commercial constraints of the data set. So if your answer from your institutional perspective to these questions are yes, 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 and yes, then you have a data set which is discoverable and reusable by the scientists. In Research Data Australia, in the last few years, we tried to measure different quality metrics around research data. And one part of this is identifying the level of connectedness between the research collections and other elements in this data ecosystem. We have 3 levels of quality checking. These are the different attributes, as you see in this table, for one research collection. The pink area is when you get the minimum required fields. We call it quality level 1. This almost means that the data set is isolated. The second one, the blue area, which is ranking 2, which includes the ranking 1 and ranking 2. In this area, we have more information, including we know that who were the researcher or the institution which collected the data. And also we know the access right. The third level, which is basically means that data set includes all the required metadata, is where we know the research grant or the research activity that includes this data set. Now, this metric is far from perfect, and we are constantly working to improve the measure of identity awareness, but also to improve the level of identity awareness for the data collections. The issue is, it is not in the capability of one institution to tackle this problem. It goes across your infrastructure, and it requires the collaboration from all the players in this area. So we sincerely welcome your input in this area. If you are interested to work on improving the level of connectedness between different elements in the research data, and if you are interested to improve the identity awareness, you can collaborate with ANS to improve this level of discovery for the Research Data Australia. Now, speaking about the collaboration can be national and international, and about the international collaboration, Adrian is going to give us some update on the international collaboration between Odin and DataSide. And I'll hand over the presentation to Adrian.
Thank you, Amir. Good morning, everyone. When we look at this, you might say, okay, that's fine. I know the name of the person who wrote it, and it's somewhere in one of our systems. It's not just the fact that we have some vague link between, the data set and these other elements of the research infrastructure. It's how we do that, how it's encoded, the information engineering of this, the informatics of this, to make it work at institutional, national, and global scales. And I'll give you some examples here of where doing this at a cottage industry level, which is the way I'd say we do it at the moment, just by writing somebody's name in some kind of a form and saying, yeah, he's the person. When you want to do this at global scales and link all the journal publications in the world, let's say 50 million, all the data output in the world, hundreds of millions, all the researchers in the world, at least tens of millions, and you want to pull that together in a system, let's say like Scopus, in order to reward you for your contribution to research, amongst that whole pool, how, what's the information engineering that would make that possible, and how do you stand out? How do you do it? How do you encode that information in the most optimal way to make that actually work for you and your organisation? So we're not saying we're not doing this, but it's how to do it effectively at global information system levels. And that wasn't on the slide, so I better get moving on to the real talk now. There's a project in Odin, called Odin, funded by the European Union. It's the ORCID and DataCite Interoperability Network. So it's looking at one part of this spectrum, the connection between researchers and data sets. And how would you make that happen? Seems simple. We start with just a small part of the spectrum. So I haven't really explained that because there's ORCID and DataCite. They both need explaining later. We'll get to that. This particular project, the Odin one, includes DataCite and ORCID, luckily, because it's an interoperability network for those two. A little bit more about those in a minute, but that's DataCite is about identifying data sets for citation, and ORCID is about identifying researchers from a particular community of practice, the journal publishing world. British Library and CERN are doing proof of concepts in this, and we'll talk about those. And ANS, Dryad and Archive are international partners giving an international perspective to the European initiative. Thanks. We're talking about ORCID, so I'll go back to explaining what the ORCID mission is: connecting researchers. So it's a researcher ID project, if you like, and being able to connect a researcher to their work, a publication, and that's where the journal publishers have come together in a consortium to have an ID that would work across that whole community. And you'd be able to link a researcher to all the journal outputs, data, and that's where ANS is. That's why ANS is part of this initiative, and the ORCID initiative and the Odin initiative. And how would you link, again, your researcher ID to any outputs, for example, that are in Research Data Australia? How would you make that easy? What systems could ANS do to make that easier and automatic? They also have the idea of linking you to any grants, affiliations and patents. These are the partners. It's mostly come from a consortium. It's like a cooperative of journals, publishers, merging the pool of their IDs to be one global pool of journal article ID, researcher ID providers. DataCite is an international consortium minting DOIs, so again, identifiers for research data sets and optimizing that for data citation. There is another talk on that this afternoon, so if you'd like to know more about DataCite, I recommend that you come in the last session to this room. So we've got a whole 2 sessions on that. So I won't say anything now, except to say that it's global and growing. Here are the, I've said that there were, within the Odin project, there are a couple of proof of concept projects. The first one is with CERN. So what's the big deal? Connecting researchers to data. What's the problem? Here's the CERN, it's like their library system. It's kind of their information system that for the internal CERN workers and for other people coming to CERN to see what information they have. This is about a paper for a research project. You can see there's the title. Firstly, if you go down here, can I point? I can. Yeah. So it's been published in a journal. So it already has an identifier there. It has another identifier in the archive ePrint. It actually does exist in 2 other places. So even just the journal publication has a few identifiers, and part of this proof of concept is saying, oh, how do we make those identifiers interoperate? A little detail here, I don't know whether you've noticed, 2,191 authors. So these are the high energy physics people at CERN who do things. It's a project that's really a collaboration of nations coming together. And again, on top of that, they wanted to link that to the high energy physics data, which itself is global and has 4 levels of levels. The top level, which is absolutely impossible to use, and as they bring it down, boil it down, you get smaller pieces that are linked to journal articles. So they are using the data site DOI system to identify that data, and so they have a challenge there, bringing all those elements together. And that's no answers to that challenge yet, but that's what this proof of concept in Odin is there to address. That's just for fun. It's the kind of first page of the list of authors on that particular journal article. We haven't even got to the text yet. The second one is British Library. It's about social science data. The cohort data, so this is where you take everyone, 1,000 people born in 1965, and then go through every 5 years and check their demographic and social outcomes. So a cohort of people in a longitudinal study. That's what it's a very messy kind of thing. So if you look at the blue things, they're the original national data sets, the 1958 data set, the 1970s data set. There's journal publications that are made from that. There's derived data sets. There's grey literature reports. It's a messy kind of world. Well, it's a complex world. And if you're thinking about linking all those together, what kind of identifiers would you use and how would you use it? I'm out of time, so let's skip through. Currently, you might be able to link those. Currently a researcher would create a derived data set from a cohort study and publish something. They might get acknowledgement for that because there's a system to link the researcher to those 2 published papers, but we don't have identity awareness across all the rest of the system. And so this study, the Odin study, is to see how they might be able to get identity awareness into the derived data sets, the grey literature, external things, how they would bring identity awareness and therefore acknowledgement for all this other stuff that happens in a social science study. That's it. The Odin project is funded by the European Union, and ANS is funded by Deserta, the Department of Innovation. These are the questions. How can you measure and improve identity and awareness of research data? How do you measure impact? How do you measure reuse? And how can your organisation take advantage of some of the global emerging identity systems? And how do you increase your profile in this very big world of global identity systems? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Adrian and Amir. Does anyone have any questions for either Adrian or Amir? No questions at all? Oh, one over there.
Hi, Adrian. The question is, with these global identifiers coming in the place now with ORCID and others, where do you see the national identifiers like party identifier from National Library of Australia, and how do they sync together?
Mm-hmm. That's the great thing about standards, especially global standards. You go for 50 years with none, 0, then all of a sudden you have 5. And it's kind of the world we live in. The library world has been trying to address this problem for about 10 years, and so the national libraries have coalesced together and they feed most of their records to a thing called VIAF, their records about people, the Virtual Identity International Authority file, and VIAF has been minting these things called ISNI. Anyway, there's an international identity system in that world. That picks up people who have published books that are in libraries and who are the subjects of books. It hasn't had great coverage so far in the publishers of journals, and that's where we're hoping that ORCID, although it's another global unique identity system, it might just serve a slightly different community and therefore pick up other people. In reality, we will have lots of identifiers in the same way that you've got lots of email addresses and lots of registration numbers and all sorts of things. Researchers will have a few, but it's good to actually have a few. And if I had a data set that was connected to 3 international identities, it would be a lot easier for me to triangulate in and say, yep, you should be rewarded for this. So in one sense, yes, there'll be some overlap, but I think a couple is way better than zero. And we've worked with the National Library still, and we're going to work with the ORCID people as well. So from an ANS point of view, we stand behind better identifying researchers and better encoding that in an informatics and engineering way. And we're going to support research organisations to do whatever they feel is in their interest, and we're recommending these international systems.
Are there any other questions? Okay. In that case, I'd just like you to join me in thanking both Adrian and Amir for the presentation.